I remember the day I first suspected something was off in my marriage. It wasn't a dramatic scene or an obvious betrayal. It was a fleeting look between my wife, Sylvia, and my cousin Mark during a family cookout. They had always been close. We all grew up together, playing in the yard, sharing jokes, building childhood memories that formed the bedrock of our relationship. I chalked up the strange moment to stress, maybe tension from an argument I didn't know about, or perhaps I was misreading the situation. After all, I thought, we'd all been raised to look out for each other. Blood was thicker than water, right? Looking back, I feel foolish for being so blind. If I'd been more alert, I might have confronted the truth. But denial often finds a comfortable home in love and routine. We choose what we want to see until we can't. In truth, I was too busy with work to notice the cracks forming beneath my roof. I had a small tech startup that demanded every ounce of my attention. Late nights coding, early mornings on calls with potential investors. I was determined to make my company a success. Sylvia said she understood. She seemed proud whenever I mentioned the sacrifices I had to make for our future. Mark, on the other hand, was the golden boy of the family, beloved for his charm and quick wit. He always knew how to make my parents laugh, how to lighten any tense conversation. He was the cousin everyone admired, but also teased for his restless spirit. He jumped from job to job, drifting without a clear purpose. At least, that was the impression he gave me. If only I had known where his real focus lay and how it involved my wife. Suspicion grew gradually, an itch in my mind that flared up whenever Mark dropped by unannounced, or whenever Sylvia found excuses to leave a family gathering early. I told myself I was being paranoid. A man under constant pressure can mistake fatigue for jealousy. Still, the tension was there. My parents, older now, seemed oblivious. They adored Sylvia and Mark equally, praising them for supporting me in my entrepreneurial endeavors. My mother would gush about how lucky I was to have a wife who accepted my drive to succeed and a cousin who stepped in to help around the house whenever I was gone. Eventually, though, little signs became harder to ignore. A hushed phone call in the kitchen, a text that Sylvia quickly hid when I walked in, and those lingering glances between the two of them. By that time, my startup was on the verge of a breakthrough. News of our product's potential skyrocketed all my credibility almost overnight. Investors scheduled meetings back to back. I was traveling across the country to pitch, forging new partnerships, and rubbing shoulders with venture capitalists who saw a glimmer in my work. Meanwhile, Mark's presence at our home became more frequent. My parents absolutely never questioned it because to them, Mark was just being helpful. Sylvia kept saying she was fine, that she was proud of me for going after our dreams. Looking back, she must have been laughing behind my back, realizing how easy it was to deceive me. I won't deny it. The idea of her betrayal never crossed my mind, at least not fully. I always believed our marriage was built on trust. I had grown complacent, so wrapped up in my professional ambitions that I failed to notice the personal storm brewing right under my nose. Then, everything exploded. I came home from a work trip a day early, hoping to surprise Sylvia with dinner reservations at her favorite restaurant. The house was strangely quiet. No TV, no music, just an oppressive stillness. I walked to our bedroom, expecting to find her napping or maybe scrolling on her phone. Instead, I caught Mark slipping out of our bed. My bed. He was half-dressed, fumbling to pull his shirt over his head while she scrambled to cover herself with the sheets. It's amazing how a single moment can shatter your entire world. I felt my heart pound so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. My mind froze, refusing to process what my eyes were screaming was true. That was the instant I realized my deepest fears were more than nightmares. They were my new reality. Sylvia started crying. Mark mumbled something about it being a terrible mistake. I said nothing. Not at first. Rage like I had never felt before, white-hot, searing rage coursed through me, but I was frozen. It was almost out of body. I saw myself stepping aside, letting Mark bolt past me and out the front door. Sylvia tried to come closer, tears streaming down her face. She kept repeating my name like a broken chant, but I couldn't stand the sight of her. My fists clenched until my knuckles turned white. A pounding in my ears drowned out her sobs, her frantic explanations, everything. When I finally spoke, my voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, cold and unrecognizable. I told her to get dressed and leave. She tried to protest, said we could talk it out, but there was nothing left to say. As she packed a bag, I stared at the bedsheets, searching for some hint of the love we'd once had. Soon after, my parents and relatives heard what had happened. My mother cried, insisting there had to be a misunderstanding. My father scolded me for jumping to conclusions. For a moment, I wondered if I was in some alternate universe. Here I was, the wronged husband, yet my own parents doubted my story. I learned that Mark had already gone to them, spinning a version of events that painted him and Sylvia as a momentary lapse, a mistake fueled by confusion and stress. Somehow, my family was more inclined to believe that narrative than the truth I'd witnessed with my own eyes. My anger grew. This was not just a betrayal by Sylvia and Mark, but a betrayal by those closest to me who refused to support me in my darkest hour. I confronted them, demanding they at least acknowledge my pain. They mumbled apologies, but never took my side. Sylvia disappeared for a while, moving in with some friends. I buried myself in work. The startup was booming, and I poured every ounce of grief, rage, and betrayal into perfecting our product. My sleep was plagued by nightmares of her and Mark, but my waking hours were dedicated to forging a success no one could question. My parents told me I was being dramatic, that I should meet Sylvia halfway. They said that marriages aren't always perfect, and that people make mistakes. It was like they had no comprehension of the absolute gravity of what she'd done. In quiet moments, I wondered if I would ever recover. The heartbreak was a gaping wound, and their lack of understanding poured salt into it. Even so, I pressed on. My drive to succeed became my lifeline. I swore I'd never let anyone take advantage of my vulnerability again, with unwavering intensity. A few months passed, and that's when another bombshell dropped. I discovered Sylvia was pregnant. At first, I assumed it was mine because the timeline roughly fit with our last intimacy. But as the weeks went on, a gnawing doubt crept into my mind. Deep down, I suspected the child could be Mark's. When I confronted Sylvia, she broke down, admitting it was indeed Mark's baby. She told me this with tears running down her cheeks, as if that could possibly soften the blow. I was furious beyond words. To me, this sealed the final coffin of our marriage. There was no going back from this. But the real twist came when my parents and other relatives tried to convince me to accept the child as my own. They said family was everything. I realized then just how so far they'd go at any cost to protect Mark and Sylvia. I cut ties with them all, once and forever. If they could side with betrayal, they could live with its consequences. I moved out of state, taking my startup with me. The business was thriving, and I took the opportunity to rebrand and expand. Within 2 years, I had opened a new headquarters in a bustling city, hired a brilliant team, and secured lucrative contracts. My personal life was a mess, but my professional life soared. I threw my energy into making the company a symbol of my comeback, a testament to my refusal to be broken by infidelity and family disloyalty. Meanwhile, Sylvia gave birth to a healthy son. Through the grapevine, I heard Mark struggled to keep a job and that my family continued to enable him. I told myself I was done with them, that I would never again be pulled into their drama or their manipulations. Years passed. My startup blossomed into a multi-million-dollar enterprise, attracting acclaim in tech circles. I bought a house in an upscale neighborhood, traveled the world for conferences, and spoke on panels about entrepreneurship. Internally, though, I still carried that old wound. Sometimes I would see a happy couple at an airport or restaurant, and a pang of sadness would tear through me. I wouldn't let it consume me, but it was a reminder of what I'd lost and what had been taken from me by people I once trusted. Then, out of nowhere, my phone rang one evening. It was my mother. She sounded frail, older than I remembered. She said the family had fallen on hard times, that Mark was out of money, Sylvia was struggling to raise her son, and they all regretted what had happened. She ended with a plea for me to come home and help. I felt a surge of bitterness flood my chest. After all these years of silence, they wanted my support. They had picked their side long ago. Now they needed my money, my resources, my influence. I asked my mother if she was truly sorry about the past or if it was just desperation. She cried, saying she had no power over how things played out then, but now she wanted to make amends. I didn't give an answer right away. Instead, I told her I'd think about it. After the call, I paced my living room, reliving every painful memory. Sylvia's betrayal, Mark's cowardly escape, my parents' disbelief, and that damn child who symbolized the ultimate betrayal. I wasn't sure I wanted to see any of them again. Part of me wanted them to suffer as I had, but a tiny sliver of me wondered if closure was truly possible. Over the next week, I wrestled with my decision. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from my mother, sometimes my father, occasionally an aunt or uncle. All of them insisted that Mark had changed, that he realized he'd made a terrible mistake, that Sylvia was remorseful. I remembered the day she told me about her pregnancy, tears in her eyes, as though regret alone could erase the betrayal. I also recalled how my family had rallied around them instead of me. With each new call, I felt an odd mix of satisfaction and disgust. They were at my mercy now, needing my financial help. One evening, I poured myself a stiff drink and stared at my reflection in the window. I thought about redemption, about whether it was possible for them, or even for me. Ultimately, I decided to return to my hometown to really see the situation for myself. When I arrived, the town felt smaller than ever. My parents' home was worn and in need of repairs. My mother greeted me tearfully, hugging me as though she was afraid I'd vanish again. My father stood awkwardly in the doorway, offering a curt nod. Inside, I noticed old photos still hung on the walls, snapshots from a time when the family was intact. Mark was there, looking gaunt and nervous. He approached me, eyes downcast, mumbling an apology. I didn't respond. The sight of him made my blood simmer. I remembered him fleeing my bedroom that day like a coward. Sylvia was absent, which was a relief. I sat in the living room, letting my parents explain how Mark had lost job after job, how medical bills for the child had piled up, and how they'd nearly lost the house. They needed my help very badly, financially and emotionally. I looked each of them in the eye and stated plainly that I owed them nothing. My mother started to cry, but I refused to budge. They had turned their backs on me when I needed them most. Now they expected me to bail them out? Mark tried to speak, but I silenced him with a glare. I reminded them how they defended him, how they brushed aside my trauma. My father mumbled that family was all they had. I shot back that they should have remembered that when I was the one in pain. The tension in the room was suffocating. Finally, I told them I was willing to pay for the house repairs, but only under the condition that Mark and Sylvia never contact me again, and that they sign a legal agreement removing me from any future obligations. My mother and father looked shocked and deeply stunned. Before they could protest, I made it clear that I didn't care what happened to Mark, nor did I wish to meet Sylvia or her child. My mother begged me to reconsider, talking about forgiveness and second chances. But I stood firm. Forgiveness was off the table. I'd grown too much, endured too much, to pretend that words could heal that old wound. My father tried to intervene, but I told him that he lost the right to counsel me the day he doubted my pain. The tension thickened until Mark quietly left the room. A short while later, he returned with a worn folder containing documents. He was ready to sign whatever I wanted, he said. Desperation clung to his voice. I realized then how far he had fallen and how little pity remained in my heart. He caused his own downfall when he chose to completely betray me. I handed him the agreement I had prepared, detailing the financial assistance for the house and my parents' upkeep in exchange for permanent estrangement. He would never again approach me, call me, or show up in my life. Sylvia, too, was banned from contacting me. If they broke these terms, they'd owe me everything I had paid plus legal fees. Mark signed without reading the fine print, too desperate to salvage whatever remained of his dignity. My father watched in silence, and my mother sobbed. I half expected them to protest the harshness of my terms, but they said nothing. Maybe they realized it was a small price to pay for their survival. Once the papers were signed, I wrote a check for the house repairs and some living expenses. I also gave them a date by which I would no longer be reachable. After that date, all communication must cease. My mother tried one last time to gain my sympathy, saying she hoped I could find it in my heart to be a part of her grandson's life. The audacity was staggering. That child was the product of Sylvia and Mark's treachery, and no amount of tears would make me forget. I simply shook my head and stood to leave. My father muttered something about how I was letting anger ruin the family. I reminded him that the family had been completely ruined the moment they chose deception over loyalty. Leaving the house felt like stepping out of a graveyard. I never looked back. The next day, I made the necessary bank transfers, ensuring my parents were financially stable. I got into my car, drove back to the airport, and flew home, feeling a sense of finality I hadn't felt in years. My old life was once and truly over, completely. In the months that followed, I focused on new horizons. I developed additional products, acquired smaller startups, and invested in various philanthropic endeavors to fill the void I felt inside. I dated occasionally, but no relationship lasted long. Trust was a scarce commodity in my world. I wasn't miserable, but I wasn't entirely whole either. I figured that was the price of heartbreak. Once in a while, I'd still catch myself browsing social media for glimpses into my old circle, but I never found much. Mark and Sylvia appeared to have disappeared from the digital sphere, and my parents rarely posted anything. My mother tried calling me once, on a blocked number, but I hung up as soon as I recognized her voice. My boundaries were set. I wouldn't let the past keep me from building a future, but I also wouldn't forget the lessons I'd paid for in blood. Sometimes people ask me if I regret not giving them another chance. I tell them no. My peace was hard-won, and I see no reason to risk it for those who betrayed me. There's something liberating about knowing exactly where you stand with the world. My success no longer feels like a shield. It's simply a reflection of the resilience I found within myself. In time, I might love again, but I will never forget the day I walked into my bedroom and saw the truth laid bare. That memory guides me, reminding me that trust is precious and must be guarded. If revenge is defined by living on my own terms, free of their lies and manipulations, then I have certainly tasted its sweetness. And that, I believe, is all the closure I'll ever need. That knowledge sustains me every day. The chapter is closed, and I'm finally free.